Hey, did you ever hear of the Backster Effect? So this is an idea that this guy named Cleve Backster, who invented the lie detector. Everybody likes to talk about the lie detector. It's the thing that people use to tell the truth. But the funny thing about the Backster Effect and Cleve Backster is they never talk about all the other stuff he invented or all of his other theories. See, one of the things he discovered was right after he created the lie detector, which, you know, essentially is kind of an amazing piece of kit, he hooked it up to plants, a couple of office plants in his office. And this is all covered in a book called The Secret Life of Plants, if you ever want to get your hands on it. And in The Secret Life of Plants, he discovered that not only could plants have a sense of consciousness, like when he hooked up the lie detector to the plants, if he decided he was going to injure the plant, like burn a leaf or something like that, not when he burned the leaf, but when he decided to burn the leaf, that is to say, when he had the intention to damage the plant, it reacted. And this showed us that plants have a kind of consciousness. And he did this a bunch of times. Now, of course, the mainstream science guys were quick to come in there and be like, oh, no, we couldn't replicate his experiments, you know, and it's not, that's not real, and the guy's a kook. But, well, you can't have it both ways. You can either support his, work with lie detectors, or you don't. But the interesting thing is he did all this with plants, and then he started doing it with like house plants. Anybody who ever keeps house plants knows that there's kind of a strange connection there. Or if you're lucky enough to have a garden, when you're gardening, there's sort of a strange effect that seems to come along. And even in Japan, they have this term for moving through the forest. They call it forest bathing. And for those of us like living in British Columbia where we have a bunch of trees, or even if you're just into camping, you'll realize that there's an effect that comes over you when you're out in the trees. And I think that that's probably got something to do with this whole Bigfoot phenomenon. Like, how come we're not running into Bigfoot in the forests? Or pardon me, in the cities. We only run into them in the forests. And you got to think that if there's a registered consciousness on an office plant that lives in an environment with fluorescent lights, there's probably going to be a lot more of that in an environment with old growth trees and moss and things that have existed like that for thousands of years. Yet we don't really want to talk about that because, well, for obvious reasons, what would that do to the lumber industry? And, there's the folks who are vegetarians who are all like, oh no, we don't eat meat. Well, if you eat plants, you're still apparently affecting consciousness. And that seems to, make it to the effect that there's nothing we can do that isn't really damaging, and it becomes really, really, kind of chaotic. You're not really sure, what should I do then if I don't want to harm anything? Well, that's not really the point of this. The point is, though, is that this consciousness thing, which we know from the double slit experiment, consciousness is what affects, the path of light. It's light, not the path, but it collapses from a particle to a wave to a particle, all from consciousness. And even if you put a camera on it, that just means that cameras are going to be looking at this, and consciousness is going to observe the camera. So we know that consciousness exists outside of time. And further from that, we also know that like the human mind or consciousness is perhaps, well, we can't really say that we can talk about human consciousness, but human consciousness is the only thing we know of that can travel between dimensions. We're able to go into the astral plane, we're able to have dreams and premonitions, and we're able to communicate with things in other realms. So much so that even government experiments have gone using things like spirit writing and, believe it or not, Ouija boards and even seances in order to get deep, detailed information. So naturally, there'd be a lot of information and propaganda out there saying that none of this is real, because God knows they sure wouldn't want the rest of us being aware of consciousness and how it could affect our lives. But plants are a big deal. And plants and being in nature, that's also a big deal. The genus loci, the spirit of a place. And maybe that's something you should think about. What kind of a genus loci do you live in? What kind of an environment? Do you have any houseplants? If not, you should get some. Pop down to the local store, load up on greenery. You'll find that that'll affect your environment more than you realize.